really is about digital political economy, the political economy of the digital ecosystem, and not so much internet governance, not so much AI governance, and so on. So this is kind of the message or the theme of this talk. We want to make a couple of points now. What we now call artificial intelligence is not really a new technology, which everybody is treating it as an emerging technology or a new technology, and it doesn't create distinctive governance problems. It's actually the realization of latent capabilities for automation in an evolving digital ecosystem. So that's the first kind of premise. When we started to ask, what do we mean when we say we want to regulate or govern AI? And you start thinking about that, and as we'll see, it would require interventions into a system of relationships built around networks, software, information processors, and data. And so in general, it's meaningless to speak of regulating AI. What you want to talk about is regulating specific applications of machine learning that are occurring in this digital ecosystem. Let me try to elaborate on that. Is there any way to get rid of this? So here's the elements of what I consider to be the digital ecosystem. It's sort of like a breakdown into functional, economic, technical units. So essentially any information system consists of some kind of combination of these four elements. One of them are the computing devices, the semiconductors, the integrated circuits that process information, the digitized data, that is stored and recorded, what happens on the information system, a software that controls what happened and that provides a mechanism for humans to control inputs and outputs and instructions. And you have networks that move data and instructions around from one place to another. So the digital ecosystem must be considered as this gigantic distributed combination of all of these modular elements. You have, various information systems connected to and sharing different parts. You could be sharing data, you could be sharing software, it could be distributed through networks. The whole thing is indeed modular. So what is artificial intelligence? Well, really all it is a software application that uses feedback loops. For example, feedback between the software instructions and the data, which we call training. And there's also various forms of feedback between machine output and the human input. So you say, the AI came up with an answer to a question that was wrong, so we tweak the software to fix that problem, or we tweak the data that it's trained on, and we train it some more. AI applications are simply again, a manifestation of this digital ecosystem. So one of the reasons I really strongly insist that this is not adequately conceived as a new technology that's come out of, an invention, for example, it's come out of nowhere, is that if you look at the scientific origins of the digital ecosystem, thank you. It really is the same as the origins of what we call artificial intelligence. So there are three basic foundations. It's all mathematicians from the 1940s, essentially. And so you have information theory, which sort of quantifies information, something that Norbert Wiener and Shannon and some others were working on. And you have this definition of the binary digit, which can be represented in an electronic circuit. Shannon worked out the math in a way that most people found more acceptable than what Wiener did, but it really provides a basis for calculating things like channel capacity, storage capacity, speed, and error correction and things like that. And then you have Norbert Wiener, a very interesting character, who invented what he called cybernetics, and that was what he called the science of communication and control in the animal and the machine. And so he is talking essentially about information as a mechanism of, a method of controlling systems. And he's taking a systems perspective on the devices that are being controlled through digital mechanisms. And then you have, of course, another mathematical giant, John von Neumann. We could also mention Turing here, who came up with the essentially, Turing showed that you could reduce a computation to an algorithm that could be produced or executed by a machine. And von Neumann then defined an architecture of computing that allowed us to control those algorithms by means of software, instead of having to literally move wires around and circuit a machine, a calculating machine. You could do this through software commands. So you put these three things together and you get, from the earliest days, they're talking about what we now call artificial intelligence, although that word was attached to this for some very interesting reasons. So Turing, as early as 1947, it says, we want a machine that can learn from experience, right? We can let the machine alter its own instructions. That's that feedback loop I was talking about. And that would provide the mechanism for learning machines. Wiener, 1950, cybernetics computing have made it possible to move from what he called the sporadic design of individual automatic mechanisms. And as some of our historians of technology know, people were fiddling around with automated devices for a long time, including our Swiss clockmakers. And so he's saying, okay, that was all kind of a sporadic, individualized process, but now we have a theory of mechanisms, which is this combination of cybernetics and computing. So we can now have a general policy for the construction of any kind of an automatic mechanism. So that's 1950. And then Shannon, at this first seminal conference that was held in 1955, from which the label artificial intelligence came, said, I don't like this word. It's kind of anthropomorphic. We should be calling it automata studies. So the point of this is, again, that the sort of information theory, cybernetics, and computing put in place the elements of a digital ecosystem that was then, as it evolved, realized these capabilities for artificial intelligence, or what we now call artificial intelligence. So the progress of AI is really the progress of this digital ecosystem. We all know about Moore's law. We've had massive exponential increases in computing power through the miniaturization of integrated circuits. We've had progressive improvement in software design and architecture. We have software in which we learn, software learns from other software or incorporates other software. We have a progressive increase in networking ubiquity by adopting a single common protocol at layer 3 and 4, that is to say the internet. And again, because of increases in computing power, we're able to massively increase the speed of these networks as well as their ubiquity. And of course, as we build this digital infrastructure, everything that happens on it is in theory recordable. It can create digitized information that can be stored and disseminated and used to learn. So again, the progress of AI is really the progress of the digital ecosystem. If you look and this is in more detail in the paper, if you look at what's been happening for the last 30 years, particularly since you get the internet, you see things that really could be called AI. You have automatic scanning of websites, which is appropriately called robots. You have search engines predicting terms as you're typing them in. That's AI. You have content recommendation algorithms that are doing feedback loops based on what you've done before, saying, oh, maybe you'd like this. That's AI. You have intrusion detection algorithms in cybersecurity and deep packet inspection, where before the packet was, you just looked at the header. Then suddenly we have the processing power to do at high speed, just look at the entire packet, read patterns in it and say, oh, that's malware. We have applications that fingerprint copyrighted materials and then recognize them when you upload them into YouTube. And of course, there's the famous spelling and grammar correcting word processors, which are the bane of the existence when you're told for the 47th time that you're using passive voice. It'd be interesting to do a sociological study of the impact of this on culture, on the homogenization of language. Tarek is going to do something related to that later. He just left the room, but yeah, so this has all been present and growing in the ecosystem for the last 30 years. And then, of course, automatic language translation, which, if you remember Babelfish from the 90s, was really awful. And of course, it's just been getting better and better to the point where, it's, oh, that document's in Chinese, no big deal. Just run it through Translate. So the governance problems, and there are governance problems, massive ones, but they're, in my mind, they look awfully similar to the internet governance problems we've been talking about for the last 30 years. So spam and misinformation. I don't know how many of you remember when, the first commercial email messages and the problem of spam in the early days, like around 2000, people were just up in arms about it because just massive amounts of bad information, Viagra ads were being spewed out into the internet. Easier to produce and access undesirable content, with, of course, pornography leading the way, but other forms of really bad stuff being developed. Software vulnerabilities, so bad software that has vulnerabilities that people can discover. Now, yeah, we say AI can discover these faster and more automatically, but this has been happening for a while. Fights over copyright and online digitized assets, open source versus proprietary, the monetization of data. Again, this is really accelerated with AI, but we've been talking about that for a long time. Globalization versus national borders, tech sovereignty, blah, blah. Industrial policy, sanctions and export controls, and national security versus growth and innovation. These are problems that are, yeah, they're sort of in some ways heightened by AI applications, but they are also things that we've been talking about for some time. So getting back to governance, so when I looked at the way people were talking about governing AI, I tried to map it onto my sort of system model of the digital ecosystem. And it became clear that, yeah, if you're going to try to govern AI, you're going to have to target where are you going to get the leverage, right? Well, you're going to get leverage, if you can at all, you're going to get it from specific system components of the digital ecosystem. You're going to, like, we'll be talking later about a proposal to regulate compute, right? So they're saying essentially, somehow, in order to control AI, we need to control access to semiconductors, and the most powerful ones will be limited. But actually, in order to implement that, you've got to impose reporting requirements on networks, data, and software, because how do you know what people are doing with compute unless you have these reporting requirements? And then some of our national security mavens in Washington said, well, you can't really control semiconductors that well. because people can get access to them through the cloud, i.e. through networks. So they said, well, let's regulate clouds. Let's have export controls on cloud services. So that's the centerpiece of theirs. But then again, you are controlling access to semiconductors through cloud service providers. You are imposing restrictions and reporting on data. And the software, the models, AI models are going to have to be monitored somehow to see what the cloud service providers are doing with them. If you look at the European AI Act, they try to focus really on the software models. And so they risk classify them and they ban some applications. But they really have to enforce that by blocking non-compliant applications into the European Union through network access restrictions. And they have to have data governance rules as well. And the same with the Chinese. They, I think in a way that's very instructive for the rest of us, are really focused, as far as I understand, on AI as a content generator, and they want to make sure they're in control of content. So they focused on labeling outputs and registering algorithms. But they've also said, well, your data that you're training has to be accurate, whatever that means. Good luck with enforcing that. And of course, they're going to block external applications and external data in line with their concerns. Chinese are not so interested in computing devices control because they know that they are currently the target of computing devices control. So for those of you who do have kind of a communications background like me, that this is really a lesson in the power of framing. And we'll talk about this later when we get to the AGI and human extinction argument. But I think what happened in 2022, 2023 was that developers presented this impressive expansion of well-established digital capabilities as a new technology that was so frighteningly powerful, kind of like the invention of the atomic bomb, that it required a distinct regulatory regime. And policy entrepreneurs and business entrepreneurs seized on this to justify a new approach to the digital ecosystem. But we need to be aware of the way these interventions can threaten not just the progress of technology, but free expression and competition in this field. So I'm looking forward to the reactions to this paper and the presentations of two very distinguished commenters on internet governance, right? Because this really is the same field, in my opinion.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here at Georgetown. Take two. It's great to see you. Thank you, Milton. Thank you, Kareem, and the whole IGP for the invitation. The title of my presentation is Cybersecurity Entanglements with AI. This is an important topic, not just because it's in support of the thesis that Milton has just laid out, but also because, in my view, cybersecurity is still a great human rights issue of our time. It's necessary for privacy. It's necessary for national security. Economic rights are tied up to it, such as running the ability just to run a business or to buy something online, and the security of things that are now inside of the body and on the body, insulin pumps, cardiac appliances, the right to be secured from attacks of all kinds. And the reason that I now run a Center for Digital Ethics, even though I'm still an internet governance scholar and I very much own that nomenclature, is because ethical dilemmas are everywhere in this area. Strong encryption for certain reasons, weak encryption for others. When do you stockpile knowledge of a vulnerability in software versus disclosing it? Speech rights versus online safety. There are many, many values in tension, which makes this such an important point. But on the topic that Milton just laid out, I would like to make the point that also cybersecurity is very much completely infused with AI, and it has been for quite some time at all layers. It's so pervasive, it might actually be easier to ask, where is AI not used in cybersecurity? And we might be able to come up with some examples. some access control systems that enforce predetermined rules, maybe, you can think about encryption areas largely based on math. Some firewalls don't have to incorporate AI, but it's really the engine of much cybersecurity governance. Detection of threats of all kinds, incident response is infused with AI. Obviously, biometric controls, facial recognition, and interestingly, it's even generative AI is being used for alert generation. It's being used for patch management, anything that requires pattern detection in particular, such as pattern detection of DDoS attacks. It's long used machine learning or deep learning techniques. So AI really is in everything around cybersecurity. It's a little easier to understand when you personalize it. I'm on a trip right now. I live and work in Washington. I'm delighted to be down here in Atlanta, and I had to use I didn't have to, but I use facial recognition at the airport. My credit card company is behind the scenes looking for pattern detection and fraud. If I needed to get in touch with someone at the credit card company, I might be using a chat bot. AI is a very capacious area, but it also is broadly used in cybersecurity. Now, considering all of these AI dependencies, it might actually be more of a risk to people not to embrace AI. I'm looking forward to the discussion later about the dystopian rhetoric around AI, which I find very, very strange. Thought leaders have not only called for a ban, they have, of course, described AI as an existential threat. Now, there's an intense focus. One of my offices is just steps away from the U.S. Capitol on our Georgetown's Capitol campus. And I can tell you there is an intense focus, not just internationally, but in policy debates on the Hill and all around Washington. But it goes much further than an over focus. Some of the things that struck me were Italy initially banning some of AI, Bill Gates, people like Bill Gates, Sam Altman, Elon Musk, physicist Stephen Hawking have called AI a threat to humans. So there was the open letter that got 30,000 signatories immediately about pausing the training of AI systems. That was incredible, and respectfully disagree. The extreme rhetoric, even if it tracks somewhat with anxiety over other tech disruption cycles, none of us remember because we weren't alive when people said art is dead around photography and different industries were going to collapse. Like there is a cycle of techno disruption, but what this does and always has done in history is it distracts from concerns that we should have, including at this cybersecurity entanglement with AI. So what should we worry about? In general, speaking as an internet governance scholar, and Milton hit on many of these, every policy concern in the digital ecosystem is heightened in some way by AI. The intellectual property rights concerns are mind-boggling. I'm looking forward to that discussion. Privacy issues are heightened. Lots of questions about bias, lots of questions about discrimination and large language models. And I would add, and I think an under-discussed area is how do you find the power for all of this? And some of the environmental questions and many workforce labor questions, not to mention antitrust, export controls, great power competition. I just disclose I'm also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and there's so much discussion around that, around AI. But not surprisingly, cybersecurity concerns are also heightened by AI. So it just is a fact that AI can very quickly create phishing emails. It can, and it has created fake voice calls to try to stop people from, for example, voting in the New Hampshire primary. Whose voice? I guess it emulated Biden's voice. It creates new tools for scammers. It creates new tools for foreign adversaries. So this is just what we're dealing with. AI is already at war. And there's an arms race between cyber offense and cyber defense. So the critical point is that AI needs cybersecurity in the same way that cybersecurity needs AI. Authentication is a critical part of identifying AI work in some contexts. And it's interesting, Milton, the new word is guardrails. That's another framing question. But I think in some cases, that's not a bad word. How do we establish guardrails around privacy and other areas? There's a lot of discussion about air gapping and what that means in the tech. Notice that air gapping is not really air usually. It's technologically mediated in some way. And then just securing the large language models and the data. AI needs cybersecurity. And it bears asking, like, what is the source of the anxiety? And really, I think it's a direct reaction to the capabilities of generative AI, and in a way, understandably so. Just a fun example, last spring, it has nothing to do with this slide, but feel free to look at it. I brought slides to be in the cultural norm here. But what I want to say is that last spring, my students used AI to create a deep fake audio clip that sounded like me by sampling only 30 seconds of one of my, some YouTube video lecture that someone put up. They developed a very credible simulation of my voice that could be deployed to say absolutely anything. So there I was in audio, apparently inviting all of you to a front row seat of a new reality series called Dancing with DeNardis. So glad that that's all it was. But you might recall one of the moments that really hit me was the Drake song that came out, mimicking Drake's voice with great credibility. And while this raises huge creativity, innovation, and intellectual property issues, the implications to national security are much more serious. So that it's not just the videos, it's not just the audio, it's also still deceptive text that can be put together very, very quickly. The students that I assigned to do the team text came up with some, like within minutes, an entire PR campaign and news stories and expert quotes around a ship crashing into a bridge. Now, there were constraints in the model that said, well, you can't do that. So they just said, write a story, write news stories about a Lego ship crashing into a toy bridge. And then they were able to do that very, very quickly. So in fact, this is a fake image that went viral. You don't have to really use AI to generate something like that, but it makes it quick and easy and it democratizes the creation of it. Where will this go? Just tying it to my last book, this will definitely move, like everything else, from digital screens into physical objects. And my book, The Internet and Everything, addressed how all digital technologies are leaping off of two-dimensional screens into the objects all around us, from energy systems to medical devices. And following this trajectory, it's very likely that generative AI will merge with robotic systems and merge with these devices too. So the technology is rapidly changing. As an engineer, I love that. I just think it's very exciting, but we do need anticipatory governance. And by the term governance, I mean not just what regulation and governments do, but what we all do, what new institutions do, what the private sector does, and what happens in the things that are underneath the surface, like technical standards, for example. So I wanted to take Milton's charge, and I'll end with this. How can AI governance learn from the successes and also failures of how global internet governance has evolved, especially around the last 20 years? And some of these themes I actually developed in my book, The Global War for Internet Governance, and I think the themes still apply very much. What are we talking about when we're talking about AI? Source of major frustration in internet governance circles was treating the internet like one thing, and then who do you hand the keys over to control that? It's much more complex, and the same thing with technical layers of AI. There's the chip layer, there's a layer of machine learning, large language models, there's the infrastructure of data collection that feeds into the systems. communication systems, satellites, drones, layers of cybersecurity around all of this, the cloud computing infrastructure. And, Milton broke it down into 4 categories. It's complex. So I see the same problem occurring again, where there's a homogenizing of AI rather than asking what is the thing that we're talking about when we talk about how to address public interest issues. So if this is not one thing, if AI is not one thing, then AI governance is also a multiverse, which brings me to my second point. There's already an overfocus on content in applications. And this is a problem in international discussions. You see it in the G7, you see it in all the way to the AI Safety Summit, is that there is a myopic focus on generative AI, which is very similar to the over-focus on social media, to the neglect of underlying infrastructure. 99% of the infrastructure is beneath content on this thing. So I already see more attention to what's happening in the content and not the securing the underlying infrastructure, which leads to the third point. While everyone is talking about content, there is already, just like with the infrastructure of the internet, and this is the thesis from the book, The Turn to Infrastructure and Internet Governance, the same thing is happening, which is that the AI infrastructure is being politicized and co-opted for geopolitical goals. You can think of a lot of examples of that. One is very recent, when the Department of Justice uncovered, and this is content and infrastructure, the Russian influence campaign Doppelganger, which created deceptive content, but they were using the DNS and domain names. So they had these, what did we used to call it? Typo squatting around the DNS, where, for example, instead of using NATO.int, they used NATO.ws. So this is a technique that goes back to the 1990s. But the lesson is that what's coming is the co-opting of the infrastructure in order to achieve, or think of it as a proxy for political power, just like co-opting the domain name system for censorship, for other kinds of goals, which leads to the fourth point. I think this is really important. There is an AI clash between multilateralism and multi-stakeholder governance, very much like around internet governance. This is one of the most long-standing, interesting clashes. And Milton's point is well taken about the politics that's created by the framing and about the alarm about AI governance. So there is a sudden jolt away from private sector-led multi-stakeholder governance, and we could critique that system in many ways, but the private sector is not reflected in the international discussions. Everything is coming up multilateral. So this follows some of the tensions between multilateral governance and more of, and call it cyber sovereignty or digital sovereignty, and having an ecosystem of actors, including the people that use technologies, the standard setting institutions, the coordinating institutions, and many different kinds of actors. Cyber sovereignty, the meaning of that has shifted very much. And my last point is that communities have to converge. Here's an example from internet governance. This is a great room to be in with experts. And even in a room of like-minded experts, if you talk about national security, sometimes you call that cyber governance or cyber. When you talk about freedom of expression, we suddenly shift to calling it the internet. And in other cases, we call it digital. And there are different, the wording is important because there are different communities, and it shifts like a school of fish, depending on what the topic is that you're talking about. And I see the same thing happening in discussions around AI, where the cyber security communities need to converge with the AI governance discussions. So they're entangled, the issues are entangled, but the communities are different. This will be a problem that has to be solved. So to summarize the insights from internet governance, AI governance, very much like internet governance, involves complex technology that extends far beneath content, all in the context of the politicization of infrastructure, tensions between multi-stakeholder and multilateral approaches, and then challenges that are already arising around siloed communities, whether digital or internet or AI or cyber or any other terminology. I wrote a paper on quantum. So digital, we don't say analog. It's not the Center for Analog Ethics. I don't even like the term Center for Digital Ethics because perhaps quantum will come in. It's always changing, but far from catastrophic. And this is why attention to cybersecurity and AI is so important. My medical school colleagues are doing some really interesting work applying AI to public health and to drug discovery. It's enhancing learning. It's a powerful productivity tool, and intelligence systems, national security rely on AI already. AI is already at war, you could say. So it may be more dangerous from a national security standpoint to pause AI in certain contexts than to embrace it. And it is, of course, deeply entangled in cybersecurity. Thank you very much for listening.
So if we think about AI governance, thank you, Karim, then I thought it might be useful and helpful to ask ourselves, what is it that people are worried about? Not because we actually want to govern something, but if there is this deep-seated worry about what AI can do or what AI might do, we might want to ask ourselves, why are people worried? What's at the core of their worry? Not necessarily because we want to address that, but because we want to understand the root cause of their concern. So what makes people feel so vulnerable now? I ask this question mostly because I want to investigate this sort of the undercurrent and want to foreground it. Now, as I do this, I believe that one of the key worries that we have to deal with is exactly this, namely the worry that that AI endangers human decision making. Human decisions are here to prepare actions, and actions like choosing the path of the cyclist does, and the path that he takes. So humans want to decide. They want to decide, and they want to decide well, which is, interestingly enough, two different things. The deciding well is to actually make the right decision. The deciding, of course, is the ability to choose in the first place. So we want to decide, or people want to decide, and they want to decide well. And this is a conundrum. Most people want both. That is, to decide themselves and to decide well. They want to be in charge, but they also want to benefit from helpful guidance. And in order to address this conundrum, humanity has developed over the past millennia a tool that is quite ingenious to deal with it. A fundamental social innovation, if you want. It started a couple of thousand years ago, but it really took off under the Romans. The Romans, if you recall, unlike the Greek, were pragmatic traders rather than high-in-the-sky intellectuals. So what they came up with is what we today call private law. Now, you look at me flabbergasted. What is he talking about? private law here. The idea behind private law is to come up with helpful guardrails, with subtle nudges, with persuasive hints, as well as outright rules that both affirm and improve human decision-making. That's quite ingenious in a way. They improve human decision-making by ensuring that people don't make obvious mistakes. They don't fall into the most obvious traps, decision bias traps, for example. And if they do, these rules and guidelines offer them an effective way to get themselves out of that trap. For example, by reversing contractual obligations that they have decided to sign up. At the same token, this affirms human decision-making by letting people make their own decisions. And rather than taking that decision-making capability away from them. Yes, a decision guardrail may nudge you into a particular way, but you are free to decide otherwise if you wish. You should stand behind the yellow line, but if you wish to go beyond it, you can do so at your own risk. There is a certain beauty, I think, to this setup. And it is not just private law. Private law is one social innovation artifact, but these private law codes that the Romans started, they have persisted for hundreds and hundreds of years at a time. Think about the Code Civil in France that's been around for almost 300 years now. Why? Because the underlying balancing principle, affirming choice while facilitating good decisions, is not only pragmatic and durable, but it actually is also something, and most importantly, that is reconfirming what at the end of the day truly really matters most to us, and that is human agency. Now, with human agency, if I'm right, and making good decisions is what people care most about, then the worry vis-a-vis AI is exactly that human agency in the decision context is taken away from people. And thus AI governance is, to a significant extent, really all about decision governance. Now, at the center of decision governance is that one is on a path that is rooted in and built on human agency, on the idea that we can, at least to some extent, choose our own way forward, individually as well as societally. And that, of course, is anathema in the context of the vision of generative and general AI deciding for us, the vision that there is a robot, the sentient machine, that there is a golem that awakens and takes over. But please do note here, the real problem is not machine power. The real issue is human agency. And how governance, how guiding guardrails can help humans be better agents. So if that's true, then individual human agency is not just about the individual making his or her own decisions. It's also about another principle of deciding or decision governance design, and that is that most human actions are also rooted in the social. That because we interact with each other, we can coordinate, as these people do, and reach higher much higher and much further beyond what we could do if we were solely acting as individuals. There is much more to say about the sort of link between individual agency and societal agency, but I leave it at that. So in sum, governance guardrails need to be human agency affirming, individual and collective, so that they can be disregarded if necessary, or if they can be disregarded if desired, and accepting the resulting cost. But they also need to be adaptive, these guardrails, much like the decisions that they aim to govern themselves. Humans have long hoped to improve their decision making by revisiting the decisions that they made and by learning from the decisions that they made, whether they are their own or whether they are somebody else's decision. And that means that, in fact, we, as an example, we just think about the sharing and capturing of experiences that we do and have been doing for thousands of years. When we write stories, when we tell narratives, it's not just to entertain each other, it's actually to learn from the experiences of others. That's what the fundamental appeal is of the large and important epics of the world. Go back to the Gilgamesh or the Iliad or whatever your favorite epic is. It tells you how experiences of the past speak to you and improve your own decision making. It is all about yearning. However we look at it, we yearn to learn how to decide well. As we yearn to learn how to decide well, this learning isn't limited to our own decision making, but also means that we need to learn how to design good guardrails for how to learn well. Everything that you can do, I can do, meta. This is all about that. So if we want good governance, if we want good decision governance, I should say, then our governance guardrails need to be themselves flexible and changeable enough so that we can learn not only how to decide well, but also how to better govern the decision making that we engage in. And that brings us back to AI governance. If AI governance isn't about the governance of the machine, or the algorithm, or the LLM, or whatever anthropomorphic homunculus you prefer to insert in here, but is really about the governance of decision-making, then the governance mechanisms that we are currently employing or talking about employing in AI governance are grossly inadequate in that they rarely focus on human agency and almost never facilitate the multi-level learning that I just talked about. So this brings me to an Austrian comedian to finish up. This comedian in my native Austria once said that bad governance is like a motorcyclist that doesn't know where he's going, but surely hopes to get there first. My sense is that this is the implicit strategy of many current AI governance undertakings that we see around the world, where a wide variety of governance mechanisms is utilized, almost like throwing everything in the kitchen sink onto the problem, yet the problem itself is not fully understood. Instead, therefore, I suggest what we need to do is to be much more humble, to offer a humbler governance alternative that focuses on human decisions and human actions, that affirms agency and that facilitates learning and adaptation, instead of the image of regulation lying down and tying down and shackling down AI, I prefer guardrails of human decision making. But such a governance framework is very different from the direction that we are headed today, and that is the unfortunate end. Thank you.
First, tremendous rank for the whole thing, really great, all of you. Think I'm gonna jump a little bit more on where Victor got us, but perhaps for all of you. At some point, Victor, it sounds like what you're doing though, your hope for human agency is absolutely antithetical to all the things that Milton teed up as the broad question and Laura pointed out is happening, right? Because hanging out with the people who are just building these things, it's exactly what you said. We don't need you to have agency. The machine will do it. So I think the question about context, that what would a guardrail look like, right? In terms of just right now, so to try and keep it a little bit tight, just commercial use of AI, right? We've already had that as all of us know, right? Just click yes, right? So there's a moment of agency, but is it illusory? Or what might be something more? Because it sounds like what you're hoping for is a lot more thinking and friction. And yet I remember from way back, right, the fights over early privacy with trustee and whatnot, were basically, we don't want people to actually go through any of this. So in that sense, do we have that tension of the speed and scale of all of this means any guardrail will be either a hand wave or that yellow line where everyone's stepping over it?
Not in London.
Okay.
Fred Schauer famously told me the difference between Boston and Berlin is in Berlin, people stop at the red light of the pedestrian crossing.
Yes.
Now, so there are cultural differences.
Yeah.
Now, keep in mind, there was a particular context in which I said what I said, and that is if we want to address the concerns that people have. We may not want to.
I mean, there's a lot of noise towards those concerns,
Now,
to your
absolutely,
point.
absolutely, but I don't think there is an easy get out of jail card here. And that is if people have these concerns, and these concerns, at least to a certain extent, are focused on human agency, then taking away human agency is not going to help us, whatever kind of governance framework we put around it. Because it's not going to assuage the feeling of risk, danger, threat that the people have.
Question from the audience.
Thank you so much for your presentations. So I'm a chemist by training, so I'm really interested in the cyber physical component of the discussion. But one of the things that I think really touches home is the idea of trust, that fear of AI distorting reality for an average decision maker. And one thing that comes to mind recently is with the 2 hurricanes passing through, rapid decision needs to be made at a community level. And there were some fear that there was misinformation being sent out to folks trying to evacuate or not evacuate. What levels of, and forgive me for misspeaking or misusing the terms, governance or safety mechanisms do you have for emergency management in times of decision making?
Is this a question for anyone in particular or?
Yeah,
Yeah.
experts.
Well, I would intervene with that by kind of turning it back to Victor's idea about human agency. So as I understand it, when you do an AI application, you are automating decision making, right? And so can we automate decision making about emergencies? Gosh, what a broad scope thing, right? So if you talk about, can we automate the mechanism by which notifications are sent out, or could we somehow automate your car so that you're forced to evacuate whether you want to or not. You know, that's the kind of the level of choice that you're talking about. And I really like the way Victor emphasizes the human agency. So my follow-up question, which I think relates to the answer to your question, is how do guardrails get into place, right? What is the process by which a collective decision is made that everybody is going to have to step over a yellow line and have bumps under their feet or not, right? And that's a fairly innocuous example. So a more important example would be like, yeah, when you have that stop sign on your street, is it going to detect every time you don't come to a full stop? And that's going to be automated, and the policeman cannot decide, you know, who cares if the street is empty. It's everything is going to be automated, right? So how do you, the process by which you decide what gets automated and what guardrails are in place and how mild they are, how does that happen?
Well, yeah, just specifically to the question, and I'm thinking about Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which came out in the 1960s, about how science is what scientists say it is. In a way, that's an oversimplification. But I think that the example that you're talking about really comes down to the people that are receiving the information. And it may be a little controversial to say that, but this deception is not going to go away. We have to learn how to live with it. And, so I think the one solution to this is for people, instead of getting their news from, from scrolling through what other people are saying on Facebook, it's to go to the National Hurricane Center or to hear from the official sources in the local governments. I think that's our best chance at a solution to this, because I just don't see that kind of deception and disinformation going away. And if anything, it will accelerate because some of the technologies that are being discussed today. But I think the provenance, what is the level of expertise, and that's a shift that we all have to make rather than going with the rumor, especially in the national security context.
I'd like to offer two quick responses, one to you and one to Milton's more focused question. And I'd like to answer your very important point with a personal story. And that has to do with the fact that I grew up in a very small alpine village in Austria. And when I grew up, not so long ago, still in the 1970s, so eons away, but we had two television channels, two state-owned television. And my uncle was an electrician and put up a huge antenna on the house, gigantic antenna. And on a really good evening with clear weather, we could get the remnants of a reception of the German state-owned television channel. Now, that means that misinformation at that time was very easy to spread. The state-owned television channel just had to do it, and did it, by the way, and to an extent, shaping public opinion. Why am I telling the story? Because the past hasn't been that rosy in terms of misinformation as we think. There was a lot of misinformation in the past, and we have sometimes dealt with it and sometimes not. This is not a new problem, and it is not a problem that AI invented for us. It may have exacerbated it and so forth, but there's different mechanisms now to create that. To Milton's question, and that is, how do we design guardrails and how do we put that in place? That, of course, is the very important question, not just because designing guardrails is hard, but what are the right institutions to design guardrails? How do we institutionalize, how do we embed the process of guardrail designing in an institution? Most of the institutions that we have today, for example, in the global arena, are singularly unfit to do that. whether it's the WTO or whether it's the United Nations, because they have been designed to take a rule and roll it out globally and then enforce it.
Except for the UN, which doesn't really enforce anything.
Well, depending on which
Strongly urge, Milton.
but the idea was that there is a right answer, and we only need to roll it out, persuade people and so forth to sign up to that right answer. Now, guardrails isn't about that. Guardrails is about, yeah, there is a pretty good answer, but it may not be the best one, and you can step over that answer if you want to, much as you can step over the yellow line, or as I, coming from Alpine Austria, use it. If you climb a mountain, and I do rock climbing, then you have oftentimes a rope, a fixed rope there that you're clipped in. But you can unclip yourself from the fixed rope and climb on your own if you want to. So you have that kind of choice. All that I'm trying to say is institutionally, we don't have the institutions, the setup in place to really create guardrails and to induce guardrail creation that foster choice and human agency. And I'm worried about that.
A quick follow-up on that, there are some technical architecture guardrails that could be put in place in the example that was given. And if you think about the source of the data on what's happening with the weather, when something is flooding, looking through satellites and getting a good snapshot of what's happening at any given time. Those are all, well, in addition to satellites, which need to be secured more, there are also sensors everywhere and IoT devices everywhere, even in people's own homes where they may detect water rising or something like that. And I think raising the standards of cybersecurity around these sensors is a critical technical architecture guardrail to help with this entire problem that you laid out with disaster.
Andrew?
Yeah, I was just gonna come in on this really interesting point about sort of disasters and time pressure scenarios, and kind of build on a point you're making, Victor, about sort of what's different with AI and how this exacerbates things. I think it's a bit different. We're talking about technologies that shape choice architectures at scale and are designed intentionally to do that, and have been marketed and deployed into all kinds of contexts without the relevant due diligence for thinking through the kinds of scenarios that we're talking about, where the feature of being able to access and share information at scale or to seek information from Google search is also enabling the same kinds of distribution of false information at scale. My background is I used to work at Google for 7 years on trusted safety teams, and one of the things that we had to do at the time was I joined in 2011. It was a time when you had billions of people using Google search, and so there was a sudden awareness of oh my God, we've created something that 7% of health searches for Google are health related during crisis. So they're trying to find information. So if you're servicing the wrong information, it's actually like a life or death scenario. And they started to implement kind of some practices with teams to kind of build out a practice of how do you deliver relevant information during times of crisis or during times of severe catastrophe. That's down to human agency. It's down to human decisions. That's down to building in those processes to respond to something that you can see, or either the regulator or a policymaker or a journalist is pointing out to you. It's something that we're actively seeing Twitter undo right now. Those same features, those same teams no longer exist, and that is again a human agency, human choice. So I'm just struck by there are some safeguards and guardrails we have in place, but the question to me always is around incentives. This is kind of the second thing I want to talk about. Laura, it's so interesting your example about voice synthesis. My job after Google was working with DeepMind on a team that was developing voice synthesis tools in 2017. And we ran into that exact same scenario that you could basically, they developed a system with 10 seconds, 15 seconds of audio. You could generate someone saying almost anything to a high degree of fidelity. And the question was, why does it have to be 10 seconds, 15 seconds? That creates all kinds of risks. If you think about, if you're trying to use this for voice generation and creative processes, why not have an hour or 30 minutes requirement? So we published a paper that sort of reduced the timing required. We put an impact statement out, and the paper was rejected because the journal saw our impact statement sort of setting out these risks, and saw that we intentionally kind of made the system less accurate or less requiring so much data. And it created this incentive for the entire team immediately of like, oh, we shouldn't ask those questions. We shouldn't engage in that kind of ethical self-reflection and build those kinds of guardrails and safeguards in place. So whenever we talk about the way to actually build in these incentives, these safeguards, I think incentives is so critical here to think about from a systems level. How are you encouraging academic journals to reward ethical behavior? How are you building in safeguards so that companies are actually following through on these responsible practices they've signed up to and rewarded for doing so? Strikes me that's a part of this that just feels a really hard systems level problem to solve for, but directly relevant to maybe a challenge to talk about.
Andrew, can I just ask a clarifying question? The paper was rejected in your mind because the impact statement indicated that this could be used, the voice tool could be used for.
Yeah, this was like pre all the NeurIPS, broader impact ethics impact statement stuff. But it was.
Did you voluntarily include the impact statement?
Yes, which was not what was needed.
Right.
But actually, it was because the actual release was less efficient, so they were picking on you for the tech.
It's kind of
And your
both,
impact statement revealed that.
yeah, it's kind of both grounds. So
Right.
I think the worry was, like even with this intervention, are you still creating something that could be
Oh.
misused? And we don't want to publish
Oh, that way, not just classic CS people going, well, you didn't hit cool benchmarks.
Probably was that a bit too, but that is actually definitely a similar.
Right, 'cause that was
incentive
that
we
whole
see.
area.
Yeah.
That's really great mixing.
And do you publish it afterwards in other ways?
Yeah, did you put on archive?
Yeah, it was published, but I'll be honest, like it destroyed our teams. I was on an ethics team, destroyed our team's ability to work with research teams because they basically saw us suddenly as, problems, trying to, cause problems.
So eventually never went out, never came out as
No, it
such.
came out,
Oh,
but
did
it
it?
came out, without us, basically killed our relationship to
Oh,
convince
okay.
that team to do that kind of work.
Okay.
And Andrew,
Ethics people are albatross.
let me also make sure that I emphasize the second element of guardrail design principles that I mentioned, and that is this ability to learn. As we come up with mechanisms by which humans retain some agency, and I don't mean clicking OK on cookie pop-ups. I mean real agency. As we try to retain that, there is oftentimes no perfect solution, or no obvious perfect solution. And so what I am concerned about is that we jump on the regulatory side on the current thinking of what a good solution is, and then implement that and then roll it out globally. And then again, have institutions that push this idea. We are talking about the cookie consent pop-up window, for example. And I think we need more experimentation there so that we can also come up with better guardrails over time. And there is too little experimentation going on because, of course, experimentation comes with a cost. And we are so worried about the risk and the cost entailed in coming up with a good guardrail that we jump to the first guardrail that we can think of and then start implementing it, which is dangerous, in my view, if you don't have good guardrail in place.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say, I don't think I've been to a conference where I agree fundamentally all three. Because most people really do have a rationalistic sort of top-down projection of how all this should work. We must control AI, therefore, there's kind of a control freak aspect to this. But one point I wanted to make when you're thinking about sort of like systems governance or like private governance, as you were talking about, is a lot of times private governance, especially for transformative technologies, is facilitated by like novel institutional innovations. I always think about like insurance, right? It's a demonstrated empirical fact that there is no advanced capitalist system that exists without robust insurance markets. But like if you were contemplating capitalism 500 years ago, you wouldn't have been like, yes, we need insurance. Like that wouldn't have occurred to you. But it is empirically, a necessary institutional innovation to facilitate capitalism. And so I think about things like that too, when it comes to private governance, sort of what are the novel institutional systems, either organizational or otherwise, that we might need For, and obviously that's not the kind of thing, that's the kind of thing too that will be discovered kind of over time and organically, not the sort of thing you can institute, you can like top-down design. But I think that's worth keeping in mind that there will probably be such innovations. And like thinking about how to facilitate them, I think is important.
I wanna do a two finger there because that was kind of what I was getting at is where do these institutions or guardrails come from? It's kind of like, who has the authority? And I think many people sort of assume that we can just design society from the top down and we'll have these values that will be enforced. And in fact, things like insurance evolve as we confront problems. And there has to be kind of, even if you want to have top down power, and your example of the Romans, it's like kind of top down, but the need for these interventions has to evolve. And so there's always a question of how do you know whether you're being too top down and too centralized or not top down enough, not having enough? And that means it is an institutional problem. It's a political power problem. And one of my concerns about the discourse about the regulation of AI is that we have democratized information technology, made it incredibly cheap. Anybody can get it, anybody can do things with it. And I'm concerned about this sort of fears of AI governance creating, reversing that and just saying, okay, we need to have centralized power over who gets access to basic ICT functions.
I completely agree with both of you. Oh my God, more agreements here. The Roman private law example actually is perhaps more important than you think. There was less top down than lots of individual court decisions that then built up slowly, step by step, sort of a pragmatic fabric of guardrails if you want. And you could of course break the guardrail, you just run the risk of being caught and then having to face the consequences. And in that sense, I am reminded of these of insurance in the insurance example, because insurance isn't just a institution, but when the insurance came about, they then designed, or they then thought that what was needed was also some outside organization that would test things.
Yes.
And improve materials, building materials and so forth. Underwriter laboratories came out of an insurance push in order to sort of better understand and then lower risk.
Right.
So we have not just insurance, we have a whole ecosystem around that that is helping, and that sort of slowly but steadily grew. And we are not trying to do that in the AI, but we should. That's the kind of experimentation push that I made.
So we got Andreas and then Laura. So Andreas has been sitting there for a long time.
Oh, no, all good, all good. I am curious, I'm not sure maybe if I'm only partially understood that or not, but the idea of like capital letter G guardrails and lowercase guardrails, in the sense of like, you know, and Andrew, you can talk much more about that, right? The lowercase, if that's the right framing here, but kind of like the guardrails, companies do guardrails. They have been doing that for a while. There's probably a process in there. They're all decentralized. Every company does it by themselves. There's no kind of like, you know, oversight board or anything like that, right? But there's like, I guess, a push to some more or less to agree to do that, right? Whether or not they're effective, we can talk about that. And then I think with Viktor, what you're talking about is probably more like a capital letter G guardrail, right? As a society, instead of regulation, we come up with guardrails as an alternative approach to do that. And I'm curious to what degree, you know, is there a middle ground between those two? Is there maybe a path forward where we start to centralize those individual decentralized guardrails at different companies and then come up with a similar solution in the middle? I'm just curious how those maybe different approaches come together, because what you're saying is like, there's regulation is taking place, it's not going in the right direction, we should rethink about how we do this. At the same time, there is something happening at companies, but there are distinct conversations, right? I was curious if they, given there's a practical experience doing that, the lowercase guardrails versus what you were talking about. So this is not a very well-formed question, but I just want to put this out there. There's one addendum that I want to make or maybe I should let you guys respond to that first, because I was curious about the idea about experiments and cost, and given this is all digital systems, I don't get the point why experimentation will be expensive to do. It's just some computation you run.
I think it means social experimentation with institutions, which
Okay,
is
very good.
extremely
Okay,
expensive.
okay.
But anyway, we have to cut off in a few minutes, so
I'll find.
Yeah, I'll do a two finger to this, and it also ties to what Dean and Victor said. This shift from governance to guardrails is a really interesting one, but I think they have something in common. In that, just like the technology is not one thing, it's an ecosystem of different layers, and you could argue about the layers that we're talking about, but it's an ecosystem. And the guardrails and the governance are also an ecosystem of different actors, with regulation, international cooperation being one part of it. And there does need to be clarification on liability. Privacy does need to be addressed. There are certain things that need to happen, you know, and there are many different intersections between traditional governments or traditional guardrails and the ecosystem of AI. But one actor that's often left out, and this kind of speaks to the last three comments, is not what most people would call non-tech corporations. And if you talk to technology, if you talk to just any company, and I'm thinking about every year I do trainings for people on boards about what they need to know about corporate cybersecurity through the Yale School of Management, including Women on Boards program. It's a great program. What do they need to know about corporate cybersecurity? They already know it. So all firms are now tech firms, including insurance, financial, retail. They all have cyber components, cyber dependencies. They all get affected by a data breach, and they're now starting to be concerned about AI. So I think that is a source of intersection with the insurance markets, because they all want to have cyber liability insurance. Once you do that, you get over a certain hurdle and secure everything. And so I think it's a really interesting question to ask and area to explore. And I say this to the PhD students in this room. Well, what would the insurance look like around the AI ecosystem? And that there is some opportunity there as a two finger.
No two finger, but I just wanted to echo what Laura said and answer your question to me about the guardrail with the capital G and the small g. And that is, my view of guardrails is that we are, through experimentation and learning, eventually, hopefully, find a consensus about what a good guardrail is, and then we roll that out. No question. I mean, if we come to a really good guardrail, we should roll it out. That's the only efficient answer. Then continuing experimentation is inefficient and useless. Once we have found a pretty good solution, we should use that. So in that sense, the guardrails with the capital G has at its long-term goal a homogeneous regulatory setup, if you want. But before that, there is a significant period of experimentation in order to identify what the real good long-term solution is.
Perhaps take one final comment before we break.
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna come back to Laura's question or Laura's point on insurance and cyber insurance, but I guess. And you probably know this more than most of us, the cyber insurance space is one that I think is primarily geared at corporations. There's no sort of individual cybersecurity insurance, as far as I know. Do you think there's an analogy there to be made with AI, kind of like companies wanting to get involved in AI insurance or some kind of, I mean, I think it's still a nascent field, the cyber insurance field, and maybe there's an analogy there to what you might create out of an insurance space for AI.
Yeah, in my opinion, AI needs to be incorporated into the existing structures of liability insurance, cyber insurance, data breach things
So no,
within corporations. But I think you raised a really interesting question about what about the rest of us, and whether that will start to enter individual insurance. I'm not sure about that, but that's an interesting question.
I have cyber insurance in my personal liability.
as an individual, okay, liability insurance.
Yeah, it's I didn't get it specifically though. It's just part of my.
But it doesn't tell you it doesn't have the same requirements on you to prove that you've gone
That's
over a
right.
certain
That-
bar like.
No, it's
corporations do.
not a governance mechanism over my own cybersecurity.
So it
practice.
ensures, the idea would be that you're insured against things that happen to you, like a data breach or.
Ransomware.
Ransomware.
But you don't have to demonstrate that you're using multi-factor or anything else.
Not to my knowledge.
That's interesting.
It's possible on insurance. It's possible.
You should look at that.
Yeah, it's possible I have a non-valid insurance policy for that reason.
And some umbrella insurance companies mention it, but it's nothing like the kinds of check marks you have to do as a corporation in order to be eligible for that.
Right, okay.
All right.